okay through this. So just let me know if you can't hear me and I can move the mic, because often when people are like, oh, it's fine, it's not actually fine. I like to start off with a land acknowledgement, which we do for almost all our meetings now, I feel like, at the Alaska Regional Office, so this is adapted. I acknowledge that I live and work on indigenous homelands of Alaska's Native people who have been indigenous to this land for over 10,000 years, living their culture and tribal values as their ancestors and elders taught them. I acknowledge the tribes never relinquished their property rights or their ownership and stewardship of their land and waterways. I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on Tlingit Tlingit land. I want to thank each tribe, Guneshish, for their stewardship of their land and waterways since time immemorial. Thank you for your patience as we learn. So I'm going to give you kind of a talk that's a mix of two things. One is like my background, kind of what I do, one of the cool trips I went on recently, just pictures, and then I'm going to talk about my book. Hopefully this is all under an hour, but the first part I talk is often what I give to undergrad audiences, but I think it helps everyone understand my background a little bit better. So I wanted to be a marine scientist of some sort since I can remember, and when I was in undergrad, I did my first research internship at Toolik Lake Field Station in Alaska, which is one of the reasons why I ended back up here in 2022, 16 years later. I was not doing marine science though. I was doing soil science and chemistry, and I learned that I very badly wanted to go back to marine science, but it was a really great experience in Alaska. And we did have a lot of fun. You can see from the picture in the lower left hand, that's me and other intern Ben and grad student Marcel, who's pretending that, you know, she's using a whip as we carried her canoe full of fertilizer across the frozen lake. This is not actually how it worked, but we did actually drag canoes full of fertilizer with life jackets on in case the ice broke and we fell through, because that's a very, you know, Alaskan research kind of thing. Thought maybe you guys would appreciate it. The following year, I did a Sea Education Association cruise Tahiti to Hawaii, which was sort of the opposite of being in the middle of the tundra. I was in the middle of the blue ocean. I really loved that, and I actually ended up, while I was at Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, going to the bottom of the ocean in Alvin the submarine. I did deep sea research for a while during my master's. However, I realized that without a lot of funding to go on big ships, I was mostly stuck inside looking at a microscope, scraping like sulfur off of deep sea samples and not really getting to go out very much. So I left my master's and went to I started a PhD there, and I left with a master's, and I had an opportunity to study scallop reproduction, which I thought was really cool, at the University of Maine. And I also did some work at Bigelow Laboratories, which is right there. I thought reproduction was really cool because I think life history, how animals survive and reproduce, is just really fascinating. And then invertebrates, things without backbones, I think is even more interesting, which I know might not hit home at like a bird society, but I think they're the coolest things. And scallops are particularly near and dear to my heart because they're so weird. They swim, even though they're bivalves, which mostly just stick to things for the rest of their lives, and they have tens to hundreds of eyes that they add as they grow. They add eyes as they grow. Who does that? And they have very large gonads. And that was the part I was most interested in terms of how they reproduce. But the other reason why I was really interested in them is because they're part of a fishery, and I think fisheries are really cool because people care about them, and they can be really culturally significant, economically significant, and ecologically significant. I did a short postdoc on blue mussel population dynamics, also in Maine. I did a postdoc in Connecticut on oyster aquaculture, specifically how much nutrients oyster farms suck up from dirty water, basically, to see how that might, those numbers might eventually influence policy. I'm still working on some manuscripts from that. And I did a short Fulbright Fellowship in Iceland on Iceland scallops on their fishery. So you can see there's kind of a running theme here. I became a professor at Roger Williams University for a couple years. I did a bunch of aquaculture and fishing related projects on quahog or clam, they call them quahogs in Rhode Island, and oyster seeding projects, biofouling work or studies on oyster aquaculture gear. Biofouling is all the organisms you don't want growing on gear, and it can really impact the growth of oysters and business costs if you're in aquaculture. But I also did some work on Jonah crab molting. There's a Jonah crab fishery there, and figuring out if they could survive tagging was most of what that study was about. And this tiny little organism over here, which is often called rust tide when it makes these giant blooms, can suffocate oysters, and I worked on an environmental DNA project related to that when I was there. However, the work environment there wasn't my favorite, and I started looking around for places that we wanted to live, me and Tom, my husband, and work environments I was really interested in. And my friend Maggie, who works at the NOAA Alaska Regional Office, said, hey, this is a pretty cool place to work and there are some job openings coming up. You should apply and move 4,000 miles here. So I did. But before I get into that, the other side of my experience that's really relevant to this job that I have now, and then also my communication career, is I did what's called a Knaus Marine Policy Fellowship. It's open to master's and PhD students. Oops, this is on some sort of timer. And I got to work in the Senate for a year with Senator Carper in the Environment and Public Works Committee in 2018, so during the Trump administration, which was very eye-opening. I'm glad I did it, but was really glad to leave. But that is very relevant to some of the work I do now in the Alaska Regional Office, as opposed to being out at the labs. So a lot of those experiences have sort of shaped what I'm interested in and what I do. And I created a Venn diagram here because that's what a lot of scientists like to do. And so I have a lot of interest in invertebrate biology and ecology. I care about shellfish and people, and I mean like harvesting, growing, and eating. And I also care a lot about human communication and connection, which is like what most of my presentation today will be about. But I just want to explain to people, like, classic science communication tends to fall into like the human side of things, and say like classic biology and ecology, we're like, wow, look at these cool facts, and that's a lot of fun, and I've done some of that. When you're looking to connect with people who are also maybe growing or harvesting things, we often call this engagement with stakeholders, although the term stakeholder is kind of falling out of favor these days. People tend to like community members, or whatever the group of people you're talking about likes to be called. That's sort of an FYI. And then the research side of my life sort of falls within this shellfish life history habitat research. That's a lot of what I've specialized in for a long time now. And then this centerpiece, which is relevant to being at the regional office, is achieving research and management goals, is sort of how all those things overlap. So I have to deal with people, I have to think about their needs, and I also have to think about the biology and ecology of organisms. So this is often a chart I show undergrads to explain like what I do and why, but I think it helps a lot of people because they're like, what do you do in a management office that still does science? So I work at the Habitat and Conservation Division. Is anyone familiar with that division at the regional office? No, probably not. I didn't even know what it was till I saw the job posting. It's all throughout NOAA, through the US, but in my office here in Alaska, we're very concerned with what's called essential fish habitat, and we're interested in its conservation, its preservation, and understanding what it is. What is essential fish habitat? Well, it's all the habitats used by federally managed fish species located offshore, nearshore, estuaries, freshwater. So like salmon, we care a lot about where it's found, even though it's in freshwater. for part of its life cycle. This also includes shellfish species. So anything that has a fishery, we care about their habitat, and we also care about their prey's habitat. And a lot of these species actually come near shore. They're not just offshore somewhere getting picked up by trawl nets. Their life history or the different stages of their life bring them near shore. And so those early life history stages when they're babies or juveniles, sometimes there's what's called nursery habitats that support them. We care a lot about conserving those. So when someone wants to build something near shore, they usually have to have a consultation with us about if it'll have impacts on essential fish habitat. So that's me. This is just a screenshot of the internet, but should you go Googling. And I'm what's called a Marine Habitat Resource Specialist. There's a lot of us in this division. It's kind of a vague title, but that actually allows us to do multiple jobs, which is really exciting because not all the divisions at NOAA are like that. Some people have very prescribed positions. So I mentioned consultations. I do a lot of nearshore habitat science. Obviously, I'm very interested in questions related to bivalves. And I'm on the Scallop Plan team, which is under the North Pacific Fishery Management Council. So I help them decide research priorities. If we need to pass any new laws or rules, I'm part of that group. I've also been working a lot with Alaska Fishery Science Center folks who are working on kelp aquaculture projects. Since I have some aquaculture background, here's a picture of me going out on a farm nearby, Sequester Farm. They're not that far here. That's Johnny there. It was a lot of fun just kind of like checking out the farm because we're trying to develop some cooperative projects with them to understand how their kelp farms might be interacting with fish and other animals in the area. I do a lot of proposal writing to come up with projects that help fill in the gaps of our habitat needs, our essential fish habitat needs, things we don't understand yet. There's a lot about the nearshore system that we actually don't have that much data on. So it's actually a really big priority for us. And it's really important as people start to want to develop more of Alaska's shoreline. And so those kinds of research projects are part of what I'm concerned with. And I have a lot of proposal writing experience, having been a professor beforehand. And then we collaborate with agency partners like the Army Corps of Engineers, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, ADF&G, whoever, on projects. So what I wanted to share some pictures with you about, because it's really cool, and also it was requested that I do this, is in September I got to go to Aka Island in the Aleutians. Has anyone here been there or anywhere near there? No, probably not. So I know that I'm really lucky because I've only lived in Alaska for like less than a year and a half, and I've gotten to go all the way out to Aka. And it's right next to Adak, and you can see it's like probably closer to Japan and Russia than it is to the US. And here's Juneau right here. It's 40 people live there, the native village of Aka. During World War II, they were evacuated and most of their village was burned down so that the Japanese couldn't camp out there. And I don't remember how many people were returned or how many years later, but when they came back, they had to, like many communities in the Aleutians, had to rebuild again. And the island is only 65 miles long. I think there's like 1 or 2 active volcanoes on there, and it's 2 to 20 miles wide, and it's absolutely gorgeous. And what they're really interested in, there's, I forget the name of it, but in Congress, there's like certain allotments of money to help tribes with infrastructure projects. And they used to have in Aka a fish processing plant that has since closed for various reasons. But they're really hoping that if they created a better harbor, that maybe fishing boats would come in to bring their catch and they could process it and start rebuilding the community, because they're worried about losing more and more people. They want people to move back, but people won't move back unless there are jobs. And so this is a project that the Army Corps of Engineers undertakes. I don't know if you've ever had anyone from the Corps come and present, but that's a lot of what they do is they help communities with project needs like this kind of thing. So under the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, some folks from the Corps reached out to me and people from other agencies to be like, hey, we're going to do this project. We need to figure out where's the best place for this harbor and what kind of environmental impacts could it have. We don't have any data about what organisms are there, so we need to just go out there and collect information, which is pretty exciting as a scientist to be like, hey, we have no data here. Why don't you come help us collect some? And the thing is, too, the reason why they do this is because we're going to have to review what they do anyway for a consultation. And so having us part of the project helps make things happen a little bit quicker. So just some more close-ups. This is Nazem Bay, where we went. You can see the native village of Alaska and sort of the Google Maps there. And the part of the project that we were really there for in September was to assess potential environmental impacts with our study. This is a picture of what they call the Old Village, and that's Nazem Bay. This is actually a continuation of the same view. It's just one is at 8 a.m. in the morning, which is when the sun comes up there in September. It was really cool to not have to get up early to see the sunrise. And then this is in the middle of the day. So it's absolutely gorgeous, windswept, volcanic hills with tons of grass everywhere. And as a team, we did minnow traps, put out crab pots at various places, did beach seining, collected environmental DNA, and did what's called benthic camera surveys. There were a lot of village dogs that followed us everywhere. I included a couple pictures, and actually when I was writing down data, one just hung out with me and let me pet him while I was, writing numbers down on a sheet. And the sampling team included a couple guys from the Corps, Chris and Matt. Andrew from ADF&G came along, as well as a few of the villagers who drove the boats. And I don't remember their names because I didn't go out with them on certain parts of the sampling that we divvied up. We had to do all this in a day and a half because we got stuck in Dutch Harbor for 3 days. And luckily we'd planned enough time that we could do all of that. I think the Corps guys really know what they're doing. But we did everything in a day and a half, so we split up into teams. I think we put out 3 sets of pots. And the idea with those is you're supposed to catch crabs, but also other species that you might find. We did beach seining, which is where there's some of us on shore holding a line. This net with lead weights on the bottom of it goes out. There's floats on the top, and them in the boat come and bring it around, and then we scoop up everything that under this area all the way to the shore, and then we measure and count all the fish. And so you can see Chris and Andrew doing the hard work of counting and measuring while I'm taking notes and petting a dog right next to me. And I can't really show you the data, but I just wanted to show you some pictures of it. A lot of it is not necessarily meaningful in the sense that we've gone there before, but it was just kind of nice to know generally what was there. And the minnow traps, so you can see some of the cages that we would put out with some roe. And then I think this is the coolest thing from the whole trip were these camera surveys. We would just drop the camera down. It was like a GoPro for 5 minutes, and it was amazing what you could see with just a GoPro bobbing along. This particular snapshot is the most exciting part of the trip because I remember Matt was like, what are all these things? They look like, I don't know what they are, these mounds growing. And I was like, those are mussels. They're like mussel beds, and they're kind of coming up into these little reefs. And he was like, I have never seen this before in all my Aleutian trips. I've never, ever seen this before. So we found this tiny little mussel reef bed, and it's really cool because no one has any footage of this that we can find anyway in the Aleutians. We're not going to, that means, we're not going to like dump sediment there if we were dumping dredge material from this harbor project. But this is why we do the camera surveys, to see what's there. But it was really exciting. And it was exciting for me because it was bivalves. And most people don't care about them. But yeah, it was just really, really interesting, this mini little ecosystem. So if anyone has any questions about that part of my job and life, I'm happy to answer them now, or you can think about it. And for some reason, this is on a timer again. But I'm going to switch gears and talk more about storytelling and science in the book. My presentation's really anxious for me to do that. So if anyone has any questions. Okay. All right. Okay, so how I fell into the storytelling sea is what I like to call it. I've done a lot of different science communication activities. I've tried a lot of different things. When I was a grad student, I was like, well, this is my job as a student, to try a lot of different things, right? Even if it's not directly research related. I think being able to communicate your work really well is a really valuable skill. I feel like I'm always still working at it. But in 2013, I specifically fell into science storytelling because I saw that there was a science communication event in Miami, Florida. And I just wanted to go see Miami because I'd never seen it. And I was like, this seems like a good idea. And the Story Collider, I was like, I don't know what that is. They had pitches, or they were asking for pitches for stories. And the Story Collider is a nonprofit dedicated to humanizing science through storytelling. So whether that's scientists telling stories or people telling a story that somehow has science in it, that's what they do. If you've heard of the Moth Radio Hour, it's very similar, except that there's the science part. And they have a podcast and everything. They do shows, mostly in the US, but other places too. So I told this story about when I went in Alvin the submarine, when I used to do deep sea research. And that story was particularly important to me because around that time, my dad had a really serious stroke. And one of my strongest memories from that Alvin died was I actually got to call my dad. It was very weird. They were like, we need to test the underwater telephone. And I was like, okay. And they're like, do you have someone you'd like to call? And I was like, I guess I'll call my dad. He'll probably be at work. And so it's one of those phone calls too that was kind of embarrassing because my dad was like, oh, do you see any giant squid down there? And I was like, no, because it's a deep sea hydrothermal vent, Dad. And like, that's not their habitat. But the thing is the whole ship could hear it because it's like it's the satellite to the ship to the phone. So it's, but it was a very special moment. And so my dad had a stroke recently, and that was something that I was just like, thinking about. And so that was the first story I told with them. And I lived in Maine at the time, and I was like, you guys should come do a show in Maine. And they're like, well, maybe you could help produce those stories. I was like, me? And they're like, well, you seem to have a natural knack for storytelling. Maybe you could do more of that. So I got into producing, and producing often meant like bringing all the parts of the show together, coaching people how to tell stories, especially scientists, and telling a lot of stories myself, not just for the Story Collider, but for a lot of outlets. And I've been doing it for over 10 years now, and I really love it, and it's very cathartic, and it led me to my book. And so this is the cover of the book. Obviously you can see that it's right on the table. My co-editor, Gabi, and then myself. And we got together, sorry, there's a timer on some of these slides for some reason. We got together because, and you can see Tom in this picture, my husband, because we told a story together on stage once, which you can listen to online if you're interested. we got together because I was producing for the Story Collider, and in 2018, I told this story at a producer's retreat about, it was related to my heart condition. When I was born, I had heart surgery called transposition of the great arteries, and I was fine until I was 25, and then I got really sick, and I developed these strange arrhythmias, and I got hospitalized, and they did some tests, and they decided that I had what's called polymorphic arrhythmia, which just means many-formed arrhythmia, which means they don't know anything. And they decided to surgically implant an implantable cardioverter device, or an ICD, which was wired directly to my heart. And that was there to defibrillate me in case I needed to be defibrillated, and pace me if I needed to be paced. And I was 25 years old, and it ended my scuba diving career, which was very painful because I worked in a scuba diving lab. And, and that was like what all our work was centered around. So this story I told was about being what's called surface support during a dive, where, you know, I stay in the boat. It was really cold. I think you guys can appreciate like a Maine winter is similar to Juneau, but but maybe less wet compared to Juneau. But, you know, I was sitting there in the cold, waiting for them to come up, feeling sorry for myself. But then these fishermen came by, and they said, "Do you want a bucket of hot water?" And, you know, it's like dirty, gross, like sea water that's been heated, which smells really bad, with some like cleaning fluids and like dead little crustaceans floating around on the top of it. But at the time, it's a gift, right? It's like a November morning or whatever. And I was like, oh, you know, the divers will really appreciate this for when they come up and they put their gloves in. And they were like, it's not for them, it's for you. And I was like, oh, thank you. And it was just such an important realization that I mattered, because I really was in a place where I felt like I didn't matter, because I couldn't scuba dive and I was judged for it and treated differently. And I was like, you know what, I do matter. And that's actually a story that's in this book. So my friend Erin, who is the executive director for the Story Collider, she said, you know, that's a really beautiful story. Have you thought about publishing it? And she's like, you know, who's also told a story about disabilities and science recently on the podcast is Gabi Serrato Marx. You should send her an email and like, do something. And so I did, and Gabi and I were like, well, we don't want to just hear from us. We want to hear from lots of people. Maybe we could like write a book with lots of people, but then we didn't know how to write a book, so we bought a book called How to Write a Book Proposal. But that was in 2018, and we got started, and we sent out a couple of calls on Twitter, the site formerly known as Twitter. I call it like the dead bird site now, because it's like bird, bird, bird X in terms of the logo. It's like, like evolution and then extinction. So we started getting all these pitches that we started putting together. But then we kind of took a step back and we're like, I don't know. Hold on. Yeah, I'll just keep talking and then I'll do the next one. No one really knows who we are. And so we wrote an article about disabilities in science and the importance of having access to support, whether it's medical support or, you know, professional or personal networks. And we wrote an article in Scientific American. And shortly after that, Gabi got approached by an editor at Columbia University Press asking if she had any book ideas. And she's like, well, actually, we do. And so we started putting together a proposal for them. I forgot to mention, like, the reason why we did this project, too, is we wanted others in science to feel validated, heard, and part of a community. And stories can be, in a book, can be just one small step towards this effort, but we thought that it would be nice to have like a book, like a centerpiece for people to have conversations around, because sometimes just getting the conversation started can be hard, because sometimes people don't feel comfortable talking about their own issues because they might not feel safe enough. So I'm going to rewind a little bit because a lot of people are like, stories aren't like facts and figures the most important thing. You're a scientist. And I'm like, yes, but there's also social scientists who tell us that stories are really important because as humans, our brains are designed to digest stories. Like, we're hardwired for it. So this GIF is a double meaning where Leslie Knope says, all I have on my side is facts and science. All I have is, for this justification, is facts and science from social scientists. Those are social scientist references that support this. But I'm going to give you a little more information about what I mean about a story. A story is an account of series events through time, or that's what a narrative is also called. So that's what I mean when I'm talking about a story. And that's a little GIF from a series of unfortunate events. Because when I hear a series of events, that's what I think of. Stories, or narratives in this case, I'm just going to give you a few more facts in case you want to talk about this later. They improve our understanding. They're more interesting and engaging. They're more relatable, which is really key for getting people to get what you're talking about, which then people get what you're talking about, they're more likely to have their beliefs influence about what they think is true, which is overall very, very persuasive. So sharing stories is honestly one of the best ways you can share information. So that's stories. And then disability. A lot of people think they know what disability is, but and I learned a lot in this process about what disability is, chronic illness. A lot of people don't necessarily like to be called disabled, which is fine, but there's a lot that disability covers. According to the American Disability Act, a person who is disabled is someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. They might have a history or record of such an impairment, or a person who is perceived by others as having such an impairment. So that's the ADA definition. However, disability may be defined differently in different contexts, like your insurance plan. But that is the ADA definition. It's very diverse. I don't know why. Okay. And it's a large percentage of the population. The CDC estimates 27% of American adults are disabled in some way. And I think it's actually probably more. Like I said, some may identify as disabled or having a chronic illness, or maybe they just have a medical condition. I usually talk about having a medical condition. Sometimes it's temporary, sometimes it's permanent. And some people don't know all the time if it's going to be temporary or permanent. Some people have multiple disabilities at the same time. A lot of our authors in this book actually do. Or they might have it at different times throughout their life, different disabilities at different points in their life. And then finally, and I think this is really one of the most important things I've learned, is that some people may have a diagnosis and some may not, and access to diagnosis and treatments is often a privilege. So there may be, and this encountered this with learning disabilities a lot in college, is that students that come in with a diagnosis often have a more privileged background. It's not always true, but it was a trend that I noticed where I taught. And so some students struggled but didn't have a diagnosis, but might have had the same learning disability. And if you don't have a diagnosis, in certain cases, you don't have the accommodations you need to succeed. And that's really where having a diagnosis can be really, really beneficial. Other important considerations that I like to tell people, it means having a different or diverse perspective in our world, which is a good thing. Judy Heumann, who's a disability rights activist, this is one of my favorite quotes about disability. It only becomes a tragedy when society fails to provide the things needed to lead one's daily life. So it's not about being imperfect in a perfect world. It's about not having sort of the perfect infrastructure, having your needs met to achieve what you need to in life just to survive. And that brings me to another term that I think is really important to tell people about is ableism. It's broadly defined as discrimination in favor of able-bodied people. A lot of the time we don't even know we're doing it. There's a lot of internalized ableism, like, oh, I should be able to do this or I should be able to do that. But it's okay. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes your body just can't. And so it does sneak up on us because it's pretty broadly defined. And finally, and I think this is really relevant to like our authors in this book, and just thinking about identity, I guess, is that intersectionality is when a person's multiple social or political identities combine. And sometimes that can compound discrimination for some people. Sometimes it doesn't. It's the opposite, but it does really matter when we think about how different groups of people are affected by disability. So that was sort of the lecture part. This is more fun. We use the word Uncharted because we had a lot of questions about this. It came to mind when we were thinking about scientific discovery and journeys of health. And both Gabby and I had spent time at sea. And so we thought about what a chart is used for. It's used in navigation, it's used in science to convey facts, and then it's also used in medicine, right? Your medical chart. And so when we thought about the word uncharted, we're like, off the medical chart, off the scientific chart, and off the regularly trodden path on a map. It's a new path to forge, because a lot of us and a lot of folks that we encountered for this book had to blaze their own trail. So with that theme in mind, we divided this book into 6 sections that we thought was more fun than dividing people up by a medical condition or career stage or some other identifier. And so we sorted it by sort of narrative theme or narrative arc. Getting underway was the first section. A lot of people are starting off in their careers in this section, or starting off with a new medical condition, just like you start getting underway in a voyage. Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea is a lot of stories where people feel kind of like stuck between two things. Things are never quite getting better. Rallying the Crew is one of my favorite sections, which is all about getting help from folks in your community, and not being alone in your journey, but really working with other people to succeed. In the Heart of the Maelstrom, a maelstrom's a really bad storm, is all about stories that are these really specific, intense events that they get through one way or the other. Reflections in the Water is more thinking about things that have happened in the past for folks, and that's pretty diverse section as well. Some people went pretty academic, other folks were more, artistic, I suppose. And finally, the last section is called I Am the Captain of My Ship, and it's a lot of stories about people who have sort of taken the lead in their life. They really own their disability or medical condition, and really, have a sense of like who they are as a whole person going forward. So that is how we divided the book. This is just to overwhelm you, but this is how many different stories we have. There's 32 authors. So it's just it was so exciting to have so many different people and so many different perspectives contribute to this book. So we have different disabilities, experiences, disciplines, genders, ages, races, ethnicities, sexual orientation, and so much more in terms of how diverse these stories are. We worked hard to not just have the same story over and over again, and to try to get a lot of different types of perspectives included here. However, there were a lot of common themes: ableism in academia and research, intersectionality, compounding discrimination. There's a strong need for advocacy work that comes across in these stories. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And a lot of the authors undertake that work themselves. because they're facing a lack of support. However, there's a lot of creative problem solving and planning. It's amazing how creative and clever a lot of our authors are, and they show a lot of resilience through this. But they do get really exhausted of fighting against an unsupportive system, which is, again, a really common theme. But those that have success because they have support. But a lot of people experience loneliness at some point during these stories. So I was going to read, let's see, I was going to read probably just from one. This is my favorite chapter in the whole book. And Alma Schrag, she's a deaf field biologist, and she has done a lot of work with birds, actually. I know, everyone's like, oh. So I want to read a section that's not this quote, but the whole chapter goes back and forth between these science conferences she goes to and then field work. And overall in the science conferences, she's not very supportive in accessing the information. She's deaf. She has a hard time getting interpreters. People don't want to accommodate her. But in the field, she really thrives because she's working in these small teams that figure out how to communicate all with each other. And she does really well. So I want to read this one section. It's a little long, but it's really good. So let's see. All right. We get there as the sky starts to lighten. We both pause to catch our breath and let the birds forget the sound of our passage. I step over a few fallen logs and wedge my recorder in an upright snag, microphones angled up and outward to catch the bird song in the trees. I hit record and then step back to where the crew leader is and take out my clipboard of data sheets. I begin the vegetation assessment, filling out the sheet on my clipboard with estimates of living tree and snag cover as I look around and check distances through my rangefinder. Out of the corner of my eye, I see the crew leader noting bird species on his clipboard as he identifies individual birds calling and singing. A minute later, I am done with the vegetation survey. I pull out my smartphone and listen too, but through the oscillating lines of a spectrogram running on my phone screen where the arc and trill of bird voices look like writing. I note the slightly buzzy trill of the orange-crowned warbler, the slower, more level trill of a Wilson's warbler, and the bold, low brushstroke song of a black-headed grosbeak or American robin, which I am still trying to figure out how to distinguish. I see other songs, the buzzy chicken scratch notes of a Cassin's finch, and an uncommon treat, a canyon wren, a long sequence of clear notes that look like tilde signs. I see another I don't recognize. I snap a screenshot for reference. A minute later, I see two brief notes that look strangely precise and inorganic, and I know time's up. They're the beeps of the crew leader's stopwatch. I hop over the logs and grab my recorder, hitting the stop button. I tuck it into my pocket as I step back and quietly list the species that I recognized. The crew leader nods and adds two songs I didn't identify. I think back to the one I didn't recognize and translate the visual characteristics I saw, describing them with words that hearing people recognize, such as clear, buzzy, single note, multiple notes, and rising trill. The leader nods in recognition, assigning the song to one of the species I missed. The other song might have been too far for my phone to pick up. I may see it as the next survey point. Through the morning, we slowly work our way up to the drainage. At each survey point, I repeat the same process. Complete the vegetation survey, listen, and quietly confer. In this way, I incorporate the new songs into my visual memory so that I can spot the species at the next survey point. The process is not perfect. My phone does not have the same sensitivity as some human ears do, and I cannot pick out the songs a crew leader hears beyond 80 meters. Much later, when I describe these failures to another biologist who sometimes does point counts, she reminds me that even most hearing people are not very good at point counting and tells me to be less self-critical. The sun is high and it is beginning to get warm as we finish our last survey point and begin hiking back to the truck to grab our bee survey equipment. Again, the crew leader and I confer briefly. I will hike down the ravine and visit the bee survey points along the upper drainage. He'll drive to the bottom of the drainage and work up from there. Most people think of my bird listening as a one-hit wonder. They marvel, but they think in absolutes. If I get an identification wrong, I get a pitying look. And if I get it right, I am exceptional. There's no room to make mistakes, to learn. It's rare for other birders to engage with what I'm doing. But the crew leader does.